The whole town laughed when a broken veteran started building a home inside a cave. Until his German shepherd dug into the rock one night and uncovered something that would change the entire valley forever. High in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana, where winters can bury a town in silence and snow, a quiet veteran named Caleb Dawson tried to disappear from the world. People in Bear Hollow called him crazy when he moved into an abandoned mine with only his loyal German shepherd, Titan. But they had no idea the mountain was hiding something, and that one faithful dog was about to uncover it. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this story from today? The bus left him at the edge of Bear Hollow Valley just after sunrise. It was the kind of quiet morning that made the mountains look older than time itself. Pine trees climbed the slopes of the Bitterroot Mountains like dark green waves, and the thin October frost glittered across the fields beyond the road. Caleb Dawson stood beside the gravel shoulder with one worn duffel bag in his hand. Next to him stood a large German shepherd. The dog's coat was the color of ash and shadow, thick against the cold. His amber eyes moved constantly, watching the road, the tree line, the distant barns scattered across the valley. His name was Titan. He had once worn a military harness and ridden in the back of armored trucks across deserts half a world away. Now he stood beside the only man he trusted. Caleb took a slow breath. The air smelled different here. Cleaner, colder, quieter. For a moment, he closed his eyes and listened. Wind through the pines, a distant creek somewhere down the valley. The faint metallic clank of a cattle gate swinging in the breeze. No gunfire, no engines, no shouting. Just silence. But silence had a way of turning dangerous inside Caleb's head. A truck roared past on the road behind him. The sudden sound made Caleb flinch before he could stop himself. Titan noticed immediately. The big shepherd pressed his shoulder against Caleb's leg and gave a low, steady rumble in his chest. Not a growl, but something calmer. A reminder. You're here. You're safe. Caleb rested one hand on the dog's head. "I'm all right, boy," he murmured. The words came out rougher than he expected. 3 years earlier, Caleb Dawson had been a combat engineer in the United States Army. His unit cleared roadside bombs in narrow desert valleys, where every pile of dirt could hide death. Titan had been his partner. The dog could smell explosives buried under 2 feet of sand. More than once, Titan had saved Caleb's life. But some things a dog couldn't stop. Some things followed you home. The valley road stretched ahead of them, winding between pastures and scattered ranch houses. Bear Hollow Valley hadn't changed much since Caleb left. White fences, weathered barns, pickup trucks coated in dust. The same mountains watching everything from above. But the people had changed. Or maybe it was Caleb who had. A pickup slowed as it passed him. 2 men inside stared through the window. One of them said something Caleb couldn't hear. Both of them laughed. The truck kept going. Caleb watched it disappear around the bend. He'd seen that look before. People trying to decide if they should feel sorry for you, or afraid of you, or both. The town of Bear Hollow sat another mile down the road. Caleb walked slowly, Titan pacing beside him. By the time they reached the first row of buildings, the morning sun had climbed over the mountains. The town was small. 1 grocery store, a diner with a faded red sign, a feed supply shop, a gas station with 2 pumps that looked older than Caleb. The same place he had grown up. The same place he had dreamed about during long nights overseas. Back then he used to imagine coming home, sitting on the porch of his father's ranch, watching the sun drop behind the mountains. sleeping without hearing helicopters in his dreams. He had believed things would feel normal again, but normal had moved on without him. A screen door creaked open as he passed the diner. A couple of older men sat inside at the counter drinking coffee. One of them looked up. Recognition flickered across his face. Then something else replaced it. Not quite fear, but close enough. "Morning," Caleb said quietly. Neither man answered. Titan stopped walking. The dog looked at them through the diner window, his ears standing tall. After a moment, Caleb gently tugged the leash. "Come on." They continued down the street. The bank building stood at the end of the road. Caleb already knew what waited inside. He had received the letters months earlier while still finishing paperwork at the VA hospital. But seeing the building in person made it feel heavier. The ranch had belonged to his family for 50 years. His father had worked that land with hands that never seemed to rest. Caleb remembered fixing fences with him as a boy, remembered long summer days hauling hay beneath a blazing sky, remembered the quiet pride in his father's voice whenever he said the word home. Now the bank owned it. Debt didn't care about memories. Caleb didn't go inside. There was no reason to. Instead, he walked past the building toward the edge of town. Beyond the last house, the road turned into packed dirt. A narrow trail led toward the northern ridge of the valley. Most people never went that way anymore. The land up there was rough, rocky, hard to farm. And somewhere beyond the trees sat an old mine shaft that had collapsed decades earlier. People in Bear Hollow had a name for that place: Black Hollow Mine. Caleb stopped walking. He looked up toward the ridge. Titan sat beside him, tail resting on the ground. "You remember this place?" Caleb asked softly. The dog tilted his head slightly. Caleb smiled faintly. "Yeah, I guess you don't." Titan had never seen Bear Hollow before, but somehow the dog always understood what Caleb needed. Caleb reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The official document felt thin in his hands. His father's will. There hadn't been much left. The ranch was gone, the livestock sold, the equipment auctioned. But there was one line at the bottom, one thing the bank hadn't bothered taking: 60 acres of rocky land at the northern edge of Bear Hollow Valley. Land nobody wanted. Land that included the entrance to Black Hollow Mine. Caleb folded the paper again. He slipped it back into his pocket. Titan stood. The dog looked up toward the ridge, ears forward. The wind shifted through the pines above them. Something about that place felt empty, but not dead. Caleb took a slow breath. "All right," he said quietly. Titan wagged his tail once. Caleb adjusted the strap of his duffel bag and started walking toward the mountain. Behind him, the small town of Bear Hollow returned to its morning routine. People poured coffee, started tractors, opened shop doors. Most of them barely noticed the man and the dog heading toward the ridge, and those who did notice were already shaking their heads. The crazy veteran, the one who talked to his dog, the one who couldn't sleep through the night, the one who thought he could start over on cursed land nobody else wanted. Up ahead, the dark opening of the old mine waited like a wound in the mountainside. Caleb Dawson kept walking toward it. Titan stayed at his side. Neither of them looked back. The dirt trail climbed slowly toward the northern ridge of Bear Hollow Valley. Pine trees crowded the hillside, their long shadows stretching across the ground like dark fingers. The higher Caleb Dawson walked, the quieter the world became. The town noises faded first. Then the distant rumble of trucks on the highway disappeared. Soon, the only sounds left were the wind moving through the trees and the steady crunch of gravel under Caleb's boots. Titan moved ahead sometimes, nose low to the ground, then circled back to Caleb's side again. The dog's movements were smooth and quiet, like a shadow that had learned how to breathe. They walked for nearly 40 minutes before the trees thinned. The land changed up here. The grass grew sparse between patches of exposed rock. Old timbers lay scattered along the hillside, gray and half-rotted with age. Rusted iron cables poked out of the dirt like bones. Caleb recognized the signs immediately. Mining equipment, abandoned decades ago. He followed the slope around a bend in the ridge, and there it was, Black Hollow Mine. The entrance was a jagged opening carved into the side of the mountain. Wooden beams still framed the tunnel mouth, though most had warped and cracked with time. A few had collapsed entirely, leaving the structure leaning like a broken jaw. The opening itself yawned, black and silent. Cold air drifted out of it, carrying the faint smell of damp stone. Titan stopped walking. The shepherd stood perfectly still for a moment, studying the darkness. His ears rose slowly. Caleb crouched beside him. "What do you think, boy?" Titan stepped forward carefully, sniffing the air near the entrance. Then he gave a single quiet huff and looked back at Caleb. Not afraid, just alert. Caleb stood again and approached the tunnel. The temperature dropped immediately as he stepped beneath the sagging beams. The outside air had been chilly, but the mine felt different. Still, almost steady. Caleb placed a hand against the stone wall. Cool, but not freezing. Combat engineers spent years studying structures, how pressure moved through soil and rock, how temperature shifted underground, how tunnels held or collapsed depending on the layers around them. This one had held, at least the first section. Caleb pulled a flashlight from his duffel bag and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness. The tunnel stretched about 30 feet inward before ending in a pile of fallen rock. Old rail tracks still ran along the ground where ore carts once moved back and forth. Dust coated everything, but the structure itself looked surprisingly stable. Caleb stepped deeper inside. Titan followed immediately. Their footsteps echoed softly in the tunnel. A small chamber opened off to the right, probably where miners once stored tools or explosives. Another narrow passage curved slightly to the left. Caleb studied the ceiling. Solid rock, not timber supported. That meant whoever dug this tunnel had reached stable stone before abandoning the mine. He walked slowly along the wall, the flashlight beam sliding across old chisel marks carved into the rock. Men had worked hard here once. Years of digging, years of hope. And then, something had gone wrong. That part Caleb knew. Every kid in Bear Hollow grew up hearing the story. Back in the late 1800s, a prospector named Martin Hale had convinced investors that Copper Ridge held gold. He spent nearly 5 years blasting tunnels into the mountainside, but the gold never appeared. One winter, a cave-in killed 2 miners inside the shaft. After that, the mine closed. The investors disappeared, and the town decided the place was cursed. Caleb reached the end of the tunnel where the collapse blocked the way forward. He shined the light across the rubble. Broken stone, splintered timber, dust, nothing else. He turned the beam toward the smaller side chamber again. That one looked usable. Titan wandered inside first. The shepherd sniffed along the walls, then circled twice before sitting down, almost like he was claiming the spot. Caleb chuckled quietly. "You like it, huh?" Titan wagged his tail once. Caleb stepped into the chamber. It was roughly 20 feet wide, maybe 15 feet deep. The ceiling was high enough to stand comfortably. More importantly, the temperature felt steady. The kind of steady temperature that didn't change much between seasons. Caleb crouched again and placed his hand against the dirt floor. Dry. That mattered. If water seeped through the rock, the chamber would flood during spring thaw, but the ground here felt solid. He sat down on a flat stone and leaned back against the wall. For a moment, he just listened. The mine was silent. No wind, no rattling branches, no creaking doors, just stillness. The kind of quiet that didn't attack your nerves. Caleb hadn't realized how much he missed that. Titan padded over and lowered himself beside him. The big shepherd leaned gently into Caleb's shoulder. Caleb rested one arm across the dog's back. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, but down here, the air stayed calm. Warm compared to the mountain cold outside. Caleb closed his eyes. For a moment, just a moment, his mind stopped racing. No explosions, no alarms, no desert sun burning through armored glass. Just stone and quiet. After a while, Caleb stood again. He walked back toward the entrance and stepped outside. The afternoon sun had climbed high above the ridge. From up here, Bear Hollow Valley stretched wide and peaceful below. Tiny houses dotted the fields. Smoke curled from chimneys. The town looked almost gentle from a distance. Caleb adjusted the strap of his duffel bag. Then he looked back at the dark entrance behind him. 60 acres of rock, a broken mine, land nobody wanted. The bank certainly hadn't wanted it. The town laughed about it. But Caleb saw something else. Shelter. Stone didn't care about winter. Stone didn't care about wind. Stone held its temperature. And if a man built the right structure inside it. Caleb turned slowly toward Titan. The dog was sitting near the entrance again, watching him with calm amber eyes. Caleb's voice came out almost as a whisper. What if we didn't leave? Titan tilted his head. Caleb looked back into the tunnel. The idea sounded crazy even in his own head. Living inside a mountain. But soldiers learned one thing quickly in war. If the environment wanted to kill you, you learned to use it instead. Caleb exhaled slowly. All right, he said quietly. Titan's tail thumped once against the ground. Caleb walked back down the trail toward the valley. He had supplies to gather, tools to buy, wood to cut. If he was going to survive the winter up here, he was going to need to build something inside that mountain. And down in Bear Hollow, when people heard what Caleb Dawson planned to do with that cursed mine, they were going to laugh. They started laughing the very next morning. Caleb walked into town just after sunrise with Titan at his side and a short list folded in his pocket. The hardware store stood across from the diner, its wooden sign creaking slowly in the morning breeze. Inside, the smell of oil, sawdust, and cold metal filled the air. Old Mr. Donnelly stood behind the counter, counting a box of nails. He looked up when the bell above the door jingled. For a moment, he just stared. Caleb Dawson, he said slowly. Caleb nodded once. Morning. The old man's eyes drifted down toward Titan. The big shepherd stood quietly beside Caleb, watching everything in the room. That's one serious dog, Donnelly muttered. He's friendly, Caleb said. Mostly. Donnelly grunted. Well, what can I do for you? Caleb unfolded the list. Need lumber, he said. 2x4s. Nails, hammer, shovel, pickaxe. Some rope if you've got it. Donnelly's eyebrows climbed higher with every item. You building something? Yeah. Where? Caleb didn't hesitate. Black Hollow Mine. The old man blinked. Then he leaned his elbows on the counter and stared at Caleb for a long moment. You serious? Yes, sir. The door to the diner across the street opened at that exact moment. Two ranchers stepped inside the hardware store, stomping mud off their boots. They caught the last part of the conversation. Black Hollow? One of them said. Both men laughed. You hear that, Ray? The other said. War Hero's gonna start a mining company. Caleb kept his eyes on the counter. Titan's ears rose slightly. Not a mine, Caleb said calmly. Then what? A cabin. The laughter got louder. A cabin? Ray said. In the mine? Inside the mountain. The two ranchers exchanged looks like they had just heard the best joke of the week. Well, the first man said, I guess it beats living in a cardboard box. Donnelly cleared his throat. That'll be $43 for the supplies. Caleb counted the bills carefully from his wallet. He didn't respond to the laughter. Didn't look at the men. Titan stayed perfectly still beside him, though the dog's eyes followed every movement in the room. Once the supplies were loaded onto an old handcart, Caleb pushed it toward the door. One of the ranchers called out after him. Hey, Dawson! Caleb stopped. If that cave collapses on you, the man said with a grin, make sure you scream loud enough for the town to hear. More laughter followed him out into the street. Outside, the air felt colder. Titan walked close beside him as Caleb pushed the cart down the dirt road toward the northern ridge. The town faded behind them again. The further they climbed, the quieter things became. By midday, they reached the mine entrance. Caleb unloaded the wood first. He stacked the boards carefully just inside the tunnel, keeping them away from moisture. Titan explored the surrounding hillside, nose buried in fallen pine needles. Then the real work began. Caleb started by clearing the side chamber. Rocks first, buckets of loose stone carried outside one at a time. Dust coated his hands and clothes within minutes. Titan stayed near the entrance, watching the trees. Hours passed. The chamber slowly began to look less like a mine and more like a room. By late afternoon, Caleb leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. His shoulders ached, his hands burned. Titan wandered over and dropped a pine cone beside him. Caleb chuckled. You think this is a game? Titan wagged his tail. Caleb rubbed the dog's neck. You know, boy, in Afghanistan, we used to build shelters like this. Titan tilted his head. Not caves exactly, Caleb continued, but underground bunkers, sandbag walls, reinforced roofs. He looked around the chamber. Stone above them, solid ground below. Same idea, he said quietly. The dog rested his head on Caleb's knee. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. Then a sound cracked through the silence. A sharp metallic clang. Caleb's body reacted instantly. His heart slammed in his chest. His breathing quickened. The mine walls seemed to shrink around him. Titan jumped to his feet. The dog pressed his body against Caleb's leg, sensing the sudden panic. Caleb's hands trembled. The sound had come from outside. Just a loose metal pipe knocked over by the wind. But his mind didn't understand that yet. His mind was somewhere else. Desert heat, dust, explosions, the scream of incoming fire. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut. Not here, he whispered. Titan nudged his hand, once, twice. Caleb focused on the dog, on the warmth of Titan's fur, on the steady rhythm of the dog's breathing. Slowly, painfully, The memories faded. The cave returned. Stone walls, cool air, quiet. Caleb let out a long breath. "Thanks," he said hoarsely. Titan sat down again. Evening crept across the ridge. The temperature outside dropped quickly once the sun slid behind the mountains. Caleb lit a small lantern inside the chamber. The warm glow pushed the shadows back just enough to make the space feel human. He worked until dark. By the time he stopped, a rough wooden frame stood inside the chamber. 4 posts, cross beams. The beginning of something that might one day resemble a room. Caleb stepped back and studied it. Not pretty, but solid. Titan wandered inside the frame and turned in a slow circle before lying down. Caleb smiled. "You approve?" The shepherd thumped his tail. Outside, the valley lights flickered on one by one. Tiny yellow dots in the darkness far below. Caleb stepped outside the mine entrance. The night air cut sharp against his skin. He looked down toward the town. Somewhere down there, people were finishing dinner, watching television, laughing about the crazy veteran trying to build a house inside a cave. Caleb didn't mind. Let them laugh. Up here on the ridge, the mountain didn't care what anyone believed. Stone didn't laugh. Stone simply held. And for the first time since coming home from war, Caleb Dawson felt like he might actually be building something that could hold him, too. Morning light crept slowly across the ridge. The sun rose behind the Bitterroot Mountains, spilling pale gold across the valley below. Frost clung to the grass around the mine entrance, glittering like tiny shards of glass. Caleb stepped outside the tunnel, carrying a dented metal mug. Steam rose from the coffee inside. Titan followed him, stretching his long legs before trotting a slow circle around the clearing. The shepherd checked the trees first, then the rocks, then the slope that led down toward the valley. Satisfied, Titan returned to Caleb's side and sat quietly. Caleb took a long sip of coffee and looked back toward the mine. From the outside, it still looked like nothing more than an abandoned hole in a mountain. The beams were crooked. The entrance was dark. The ground around it was scattered with old debris from a mining operation that had died long before Caleb was born. But Caleb wasn't looking at what it was. He was looking at what it could become. He walked back inside. The air inside the tunnel was cool, but not freezing. Outside, the temperature had dropped well below 30 during the night. Inside the cave, it felt closer to 50. Stable. Quiet. Stone had memory. It held warmth when the sun touched it and released that warmth slowly through the night. Caleb had learned that in places far harsher than Montana. Combat engineers didn't just blow things up. They studied terrain, temperature, pressure, shelter. A good bunker could keep soldiers alive through a sandstorm or mortar attack. And right now, Caleb was staring at a natural bunker built by a mountain. He walked to the wooden frame he had started the night before. 4 posts, crossbeams, a rough outline of a room. Titan padded across the dirt floor and lay down inside the frame again like he owned it. Caleb laughed quietly. "You've already moved in." The dog wagged his tail. Caleb knelt beside one of the beams and checked the joints. Solid. He tightened the bolts anyway. Then he stepped back again and studied the chamber. If he added another wall here, a roof beam across there, a stovepipe venting through the natural crack in the rock above, he could create a sealed room inside the cave. Not just a shelter, a cabin. A cabin protected by thousands of tons of stone. Outside, the wind could scream across the ridge all winter. Inside, the temperature would barely change. Caleb ran the numbers in his head. Less firewood, less heat loss, more safety. He nodded slowly. "All right," he murmured. Titan lifted his head. "We're doing this." The dog stood immediately, as if he understood. The work became routine. Every morning, Caleb woke before sunrise. Titan walked the ridge while Caleb brewed coffee over a small camp stove. Then the building began. More lumber from town, more tools, more trips up the dirt trail pulling a sled loaded with supplies. The townspeople noticed quickly. One afternoon, a rusted pickup rolled up the ridge road while Caleb was hammering roof supports into place. Sheriff Harold Pike climbed out. He was a tall man with gray hair and a badge that had seen too many years in the Montana sun. He stood near the mine entrance and studied the construction inside. Caleb kept working. The hammer echoed sharply through the cave. Pike cleared his throat. "You really doing this?" Caleb didn't stop. "Looks that way. You planning on living inside a cave?" "Yes, sir." Sheriff Pike folded his arms. The wind lifted dust across the clearing. "That mine's unstable." "It's solid rock," Caleb replied calmly. Pike shook his head slowly. "You know what people in town are saying?" Caleb drove another nail into the beam. "I've got a pretty good idea. They think you've lost your mind." Titan appeared at the entrance beside Caleb, watching the sheriff carefully. Pike noticed the dog immediately. "That the army dog?" "Canine unit," Caleb said. "Looks mean." "He's protective." Pike studied the half-built structure again. "You know," he said slowly, "that land of yours could actually be worth something." Caleb stopped hammering. He looked up. "What do you mean?" Pike stepped closer. "Copper Ridge has mineral deposits all over it. Geological surveys were done here 100 years ago." "Then why'd the mine close?" "No gold." Caleb shrugged slightly. "Then it's not worth anything." Pike's eyes narrowed. "Maybe not, but a company might still buy the land for exploration." Caleb leaned the hammer against the beam. "You trying to buy it?" "Maybe." "For how much?" Pike smiled faintly. 10,000. Caleb almost laughed. 60 acres for 10,000? It's a rock pile with a hole in it. Caleb wiped sweat from his hands. "No thanks." Pike studied him carefully. "You're turning down easy money." "I'm building something here." "A cave house?" "A cabin." Pike shook his head again. "Well, Dawson, when winter hits this ridge, you'll wish you took that 10,000. Titan gave a low rumble. Pike glanced down at the dog, then back at Caleb. "Offer stands," he said. The sheriff climbed back into his truck and drove down the ridge road. Dust followed him all the way back toward the valley. Caleb watched until the truck disappeared. Titan walked over and nudged his hand. Caleb scratched the dog's ear. $10,000, he muttered. Titan snorted softly. Caleb turned back toward the cabin frame. He lifted the hammer again. "Let's keep building." Days turned into weeks. The wooden walls rose inside the chamber. Caleb installed a small iron stove he found at the scrapyard in town. He ran a pipe through a narrow, natural fissure in the rock that carried smoke safely outside. He packed the outer walls with earth and stone to trap heat. By the time the first snow dusted the ridge, the cave cabin was nearly finished. From the outside, the mine still looked abandoned. But inside, a warm yellow glow now filled the chamber. Titan slept beside the stove, and Caleb Dawson finally had a roof over his head. Down in Bear Hollow Valley, people were still laughing. They laughed in the diner. They laughed at the gas station. They laughed when Sheriff Pike mentioned the crazy veteran building a house inside a cave. None of them believed it would last the winter. But high above the valley, inside the mountain itself, the cabin stood strong. And the mountain wasn't laughing. The first real snow came in early November. It started as thin white dust drifting across the ridge at sunrise. By midday, the wind pushed heavier clouds over the Bitterroot Mountains, and flakes began to fall steadily across Bear Hollow Valley. From the entrance of the mine, Caleb Dawson watched the storm settle across the valley floor. Fields disappeared beneath a blanket of white. The roofs of the ranch houses turned pale. Even the dirt road leading into town faded beneath drifting snow. Behind him, inside the cave, the iron stove gave off a steady glow. The cabin he had built inside the mountain held the warmth like a secret. Stone walls didn't let heat escape easily. That had been the entire idea. Caleb stepped back inside and shut the heavy wooden door he had installed across the cave entrance. The temperature inside barely changed. Titan lifted his head from beside the stove and watched Caleb walk across the room. "You were right," Caleb said quietly. Titan's tail thumped against the floor. "You picked the best spot in the whole cave." The shepherd stood and stretched, long legs unfolding slowly. Then he padded toward the back of the chamber. Over the past few weeks, Caleb had begun clearing a second passage deeper inside the mine. The old tunnel branched into another small chamber beyond the first collapse. Most of it had been buried under loose stone. Caleb had spent hours digging and hauling rubble out one bucket at a time. Now the opening was wide enough to crawl through. Titan slipped through the gap first. Caleb grabbed his lantern and followed. The air inside the second chamber felt cooler, but still dry. The lantern light revealed pale sandstone walls streaked with thin white veins of quartz. Old mining marks scarred the rock where picks had chipped away more than a century earlier. Titan wandered toward the far wall. Then suddenly he stopped. The dog's body stiffened. His ears rose straight up. Caleb froze. "What is it?" Titan lowered his nose to the ground. He sniffed once, twice. Then he began scratching at the dirt near the base of the wall. Not the playful scratching Caleb had seen before. This was focused, deliberate. The dog dug harder. Stone chips scattered across the floor. "Hey," Caleb said. Titan didn't stop. His claws scraped against rock with sharp, echoing sounds. Caleb crouched beside him. "What do you smell?" Titan let out a low whine but kept digging. The dog uncovered a small patch of exposed stone beneath the dirt. The lantern light caught something strange inside the rock. A tiny reflection. Caleb leaned closer. He brushed dust away with his fingers. A thin line of quartz ran through the sandstone. Inside the quartz were small metallic flecks. At first, Caleb thought it might just be pyrite, fool's gold. But the color looked different. Warmer, deeper. His pulse quickened slightly. "Hold on," he murmured. Caleb grabbed a small hammer from his tool belt. Titan stepped back but kept watching. Caleb tapped the stone gently. A small fragment broke loose. He lifted it toward the lantern. The gold-colored flecks gleamed softly inside the quartz. Not bright, not flashy, but unmistakable. Caleb stared at it for a long moment. He had spent summers working in an ore yard when he was 16. Just hauling rocks, cleaning equipment. But he had learned enough to recognize what real ore looked like. Quartz veins were common in these mountains. Most held nothing valuable. But sometimes they carried gold. Caleb looked back at the wall. The quartz line continued several feet across the rock face, thin but consistent. His heart began to beat faster. Titan stepped closer and nudged Caleb's arm. The dog seemed proud of his discovery. Caleb rubbed the shepherd's neck slowly. "Well, I'll be damned." Titan wagged his tail. Caleb stood and walked slowly along the wall. The quartz vein continued further than he expected. Several small sections glittered faintly beneath the lantern light. Not enough to prove anything, but enough to make Caleb wonder. 100 years ago, the miners had stopped digging here. Maybe they had missed this section. Maybe the collapse had buried the richest part of the vein. Or maybe it was nothing, just a trace, just another rock. Caleb turned the small fragment over in his hand. The weight felt slightly heavier than normal stone. He slipped it into his pocket. Titan barked once. "Yeah," Caleb said quietly. "We're not telling anyone yet." The dog tilted his head. Caleb looked back toward the main chamber. Sheriff Pike's offer drifted through his memory. $10,000 for 60 acres of useless rock. Caleb smiled faintly. "Let's just keep working." Over the next few days, Caleb returned to the second chamber again and again. He chipped away small sections of rock around the quartz vein. Each time he uncovered a few more golden flecks. Never large pieces, just dust. Tiny fragments caught inside the stone. But the pattern repeated itself, again and again. Titan stayed beside him the entire time. Sometimes the dog would sniff the rock and paw at new sections like he knew exactly where to dig. Caleb began to trust those instincts. The shepherd had saved his life in the desert by detecting explosives hidden beneath sand. If Titan believed something was buried in that wall, Caleb paid attention. Snow continued falling outside. By late November, the ridge road disappeared entirely beneath drifts. The town rarely sent anyone up that way anymore. But one afternoon, Caleb noticed something strange near the mine entrance. Footprints. Not his, not Titan's. Fresh tracks pressed into the snow. Boot prints. Someone had climbed the ridge while he was working inside. Titan noticed them too. The shepherd sniffed the tracks and let out a low, warning growl. Caleb followed the prints a few yards down the trail. They led toward the valley. Whoever had come up here had left quickly. Caleb stared down the slope. Sheriff Pike's truck sometimes drove that road. Or maybe one of the ranchers from town had decided to see the crazy cave for themselves. Either way, someone had been watching. Caleb returned to the mine and shut the heavy door. Inside, the warmth wrapped around him again. Titan stood guard near the entrance. Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out the quartz fragment. The golden flecks caught the lantern light. He turned the stone slowly in his fingers. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the entire vein would disappear a few feet deeper into the rock. But maybe, just maybe, Titan had uncovered something the miners 100 years ago never found. Caleb slid the fragment into a small leather pouch. Then he tucked the pouch beneath a loose stone beside his bed. "Not yet," he whispered. Titan lay down beside the stove again. Outside, the snow continued to fall across Bear Hollow Valley. And somewhere down in the town below, people were still laughing about the veteran living inside a cave. They had no idea what Titan had just found buried inside the mountain. Winter settled deeper across Bear Hollow Valley. Snow covered the roads for days at a time. Frost clung to the pine trees along the ridge like silver needles. The mountain air carried a stillness that only came when cold sank deep into the land. Inside the cave cabin, the stove burned steadily. Caleb Dawson split firewood near the entrance while Titan rested beside the doorway, watching the snowy slope below. Life had fallen into a rhythm. Morning coffee, walk the ridge, clear more rock from the second chamber, check the quartz vein, say nothing. The gold flecks were still there, tiny, scattered through the white quartz like dust trapped in glass. Not enough to prove anything, but enough to keep Caleb digging. Titan often found new spots before Caleb did. The dog would sniff along the wall, then scratch at the rock until Caleb chipped it open. Every time the lantern light revealed another glimmer of gold. Caleb kept the pieces hidden. The small leather pouch beneath the loose stone slowly grew heavier. One afternoon, as Caleb hauled a bucket of rubble toward the cave entrance, Titan suddenly stiffened. The dog's ears rose. His eyes locked on the trail. Caleb followed his gaze. A truck was climbing the ridge. The dark shape moved slowly through the snow. Caleb set the bucket down. Titan stepped forward, tail low but steady. The truck stopped near the mine entrance. Sheriff Harold Pike climbed out. His boots crunched loudly in the snow as he walked toward the cave. Titan let out a deep, warning growl. "Easy," Caleb murmured. The sheriff stopped a few feet from the entrance and looked inside. The cabin light glowed warm against the stone walls. Smoke drifted gently from the pipe Caleb had run through the rock. Pike whistled quietly. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. Caleb leaned against the doorway. "Afternoon, Sheriff." Pike stepped closer, brushing snow from his coat. "You actually did it." "Looks that way." The sheriff studied the cabin walls, the stove, the stacked firewood. "You planning to stay up here all winter?" "That's the idea." Pike shook his head slowly. "You know this ridge gets 30 feet of snow some years." "I know. And if that mine collapses, it won't." Pike looked up at the stone ceiling. "You sound pretty confident." Caleb didn't answer. Titan sat between them, watching the sheriff without blinking. After a moment, Pike shoved his hands into his coat pockets. "People in town are talking." "About the cave?" "About you." Caleb shrugged slightly. "Nothing new." Pike nodded. "They say you're digging back there." Caleb felt his chest tighten slightly. "Digging?" "In the mine." "I'm clearing space." Pike stepped further inside the cave. His boots echoed softly across the stone floor. "Mind if I look around?" Caleb didn't move. "You already are." Pike walked slowly along the wooden walls Caleb had built. He studied the structure carefully. The sheriff wasn't a stupid man. His eyes missed very little. Titan followed every step Pike took. The dog stayed silent, but the tension in his body was obvious. Eventually, Pike stopped near the passage that led to the second chamber. "What's back there?" "More cave." "You mind if I see it?" Caleb shook his head once. "Yeah." Pike turned slowly. "Why?" "It's not finished." The sheriff studied Caleb's face. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The wind outside pushed snow across the entrance. Finally, Pike exhaled. "You sure you don't want to reconsider my offer?" Caleb folded his arms. "The 10,000? Pike nodded. "I could raise it." Caleb almost smiled. "How much?" 15. The cave fell silent. Titan's tail twitched once. Caleb looked toward the snowy valley beyond the entrance, then back at the sheriff. "Still no." Pike rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "I checked some old records last week." "Records?" Mining surveys. Caleb's heartbeat slowed slightly. What about them? Pike shrugged. Copper Ridge has veins running through half the mountain. So I've heard. Most of them were worthless. Most. Pike's eyes sharpened. You ever find anything interesting back there? Caleb met his gaze calmly. No. Titan suddenly stood and moved closer to Caleb's side. The dog's ears flattened slightly. He didn't like the tone of the conversation. Pike noticed. Protective animal. He's loyal. The sheriff chuckled softly. Good thing. He stepped back toward the entrance. Well, Caleb, if you change your mind about selling, you know where to find me. Pike paused before leaving. Oh, one more thing. Caleb waited. The sheriff nodded toward the trail outside. Tracks in the snow the other day. Caleb said nothing. Pike's eyes narrowed slightly. Someone's been coming up here besides me. Titan's growl returned. Pike raised both hands casually. Not my men. Then he climbed back into his truck. The engine roared to life and slowly rolled down the ridge road. The sound faded into the distance. Snow drifted quietly again across the clearing. Caleb stood in the cave entrance for a long time. Titan sat beside him. You hear that? Caleb murmured. The dog tilted his head. Someone else came up here. Titan sniffed the cold air. His ears turned toward the forest. The ridge suddenly felt less empty than it had before. Caleb walked back inside the cave. The warmth from the stove wrapped around him again. But something about the air felt different now, more tense, more watchful. Caleb knelt beside the loose stone near his bed. He lifted it carefully and pulled out the leather pouch. Inside, the quartz fragments glittered softly in the lantern light. Tiny sparks of gold trapped in stone. Caleb closed the pouch again. Word gets out about this, he whispered quietly to Titan, and everything changes. Titan rested his head on Caleb's knee. Outside, the wind picked up. Snow blew across the mine entrance in long, pale waves, and somewhere out in the dark trees beyond the ridge, someone might have been watching. Night came early in Bear Hollow during winter. The sky darkened before 5, and by 6, the mountain felt like a different world entirely. Wind whispered through the tall pines, pushing snow across the ridge in long, silent waves. Inside the cave cabin, the iron stove glowed red. Caleb Dawson sat at the small wooden table he had built against the stone wall. A lantern burned softly beside him while he studied a map of the mine tunnels he had begun sketching over the past few weeks. Titan slept near the entrance, stretched across the floor where he could watch both the door and Caleb at the same time. The cave had become quiet again. But Caleb hadn't forgotten what Sheriff Pike had said. Someone had been on the ridge. The thought lingered in the back of his mind like a distant echo. Caleb folded the map and placed it beside the lantern. Outside, the wind howled briefly. Titan's ears twitched. The dog lifted his head. Caleb noticed immediately. Titan never reacted without reason. "What is it?" Caleb asked quietly. The shepherd stood slowly. His nose lifted toward the cave entrance. Another sound drifted through the wind. A faint crunch. Snow. Footsteps. Titan's body stiffened. Then he growled, low, deep. Caleb stood up. The lantern light flickered against the cave walls as he reached for the flashlight beside the door. "Stay," Caleb whispered. Titan ignored him. The dog moved closer to the entrance, muscles tense. Another crunch outside, then a second one. Not the wind, not falling snow. Boots, More than one pair. Caleb's heart began to beat harder. He stepped closer to the door and listened. A voice whispered outside. Another answered. Too quiet to understand, but close. Very close. Titan's growl turned into a sharp bark. The voices outside stopped immediately. Silence. Then suddenly, a beam of light flashed across the snow outside the cave. Someone shouted, "Inside! I told you he's inside!" Titan exploded forward. The dog lunged through the door before Caleb could stop him. "Titan!" Caleb ran outside after him. The cold air struck his face like ice. 3 men stood near the mine entrance, all wearing heavy winter coats. One held a flashlight. Another carried a rifle. The moment Titan charged toward them, the man with the rifle panicked. "Back off!" The rifle fired. The gunshot cracked across the ridge like thunder. Titan yelped. The shepherd stumbled in the snow. "No!" Caleb rushed forward. Titan tried to stand again, but his front leg buckled beneath him. Dark blood spread quickly across the white snow. The 3 men froze. One of them cursed. "I told you not to shoot!" The man holding the rifle looked terrified. "It came at me!" Caleb dropped to his knees beside Titan. The dog was breathing hard. His shoulder trembled with pain. Blood soaked through his thick fur. Titan still tried to rise. Even wounded, the shepherd turned his head toward the men and growled weakly. Still protecting. Still ready to fight. Caleb pressed his hands against the wound. "Easy, buddy, easy." The men backed away slowly. One of them lifted his hands. "We didn't mean." Caleb's voice cut through the night like steel. "Get off my land." None of them argued. They turned and ran toward the trees. Their boots crashed through the snow as they disappeared down the slope. Within seconds, they were gone. Only the wind remained. Caleb focused entirely on Titan. The dog's breathing came in short, painful bursts. Caleb tore off his jacket and pressed the fabric against the wound. "Stay with me," he whispered. Titan's eyes locked onto Caleb's face, still alert, still trusting. "You're okay," Caleb murmured, though his voice trembled. "You're okay, boy." The bullet had passed through the shoulder. Caleb could see the exit wound beneath the fur. That meant the bone might not be shattered, but the bleeding was bad. Very bad. Caleb lifted Titan carefully. The dog whimpered once, but didn't resist. Step by step, Caleb carried him back inside the cave. The warmth from the stove hit them immediately. Caleb laid Titan beside the fire. Then he moved quickly. Medical kit, bandages, alcohol. Everything he had learned in combat medicine came rushing back through his mind. He cleaned the wound. Titan groaned, but stayed still. Caleb wrapped the shoulder tightly. "Come on," Caleb whispered softly. "You've taken worse than this." Titan blinked slowly. His breathing gradually steadied, but Caleb could still see the pain in the dog's eyes. Hours passed. The wind outside grew stronger. Snow slammed against the cave entrance like waves. Caleb never moved from Titan's side. At some point in the middle of the night, Titan finally slept. Caleb sat beside him, staring into the fire. His hands still smelled like blood. The memory of the gunshot echoed in his mind. The shouting, the panic. Those men hadn't come up the ridge by accident. They had come looking for something. Caleb's eyes drifted toward the back passage of the mine, toward the quartz vein, toward the gold Titan had discovered. Someone knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. Caleb reached down and rested his hand gently on Titan's neck. The shepherd's chest rose and fell slowly. "You saved me again," Caleb whispered. Outside, the storm swallowed the mountain. Snow buried the tracks on the ridge. But the memory of that gunshot would not disappear so easily. And Caleb Dawson understood something now that he hadn't fully realized before. The cave wasn't just a home anymore. It was something people were willing to kill for. And Titan had already paid the first price. Morning came slowly to Bear Hollow Ridge. The storm that had begun during the night had not stopped. Instead, it had grown stronger, heavier, angrier. Wind howled through the pine forest like a living thing, bending branches and driving snow across the mountain in thick white curtains. Inside the cave cabin, the air remained warm. The iron stove glowed steadily. The thick stone walls held the heat just as Caleb Dawson had hoped they would. Caleb sat beside Titan, who lay on a blanket near the fire. The German shepherd's breathing had steadied during the night, but the bandage around his shoulder was already stained dark with dried blood. Caleb gently checked the wound again. "Easy, boy," he murmured. Titan opened his eyes and gave a faint thump of his tail. He tried to lift his head higher, but Caleb rested a hand on his neck. "Don't rush it." Outside, the storm roared. Caleb walked to the cave entrance and opened the heavy wooden door. The wind slammed against it immediately. Snow had already piled halfway up the doorway. The entire ridge had disappeared into a white haze. Visibility was barely 20 yards. The valley below could no longer be seen. This wasn't just another winter storm. This was the kind of blizzard people in Montana talked about for years afterward. Caleb closed the door again and bolted it shut. The cave returned to its quiet warmth. Titan watched him from beside the stove. "You hear that?" Caleb said softly. The dog's ears twitched. "That storm's going to trap half the valley." Caleb had lived long enough in Bear Hollow to understand what a storm like this meant. Roads buried, power lines snapping, livestock freezing, families stranded in farmhouses with failing heaters. He sat down again beside Titan. For a long time, he simply listened to the wind. The cave creaked softly as snow piled against the entrance. But the mountain itself did not move. The rock above them remained solid and silent. Hours passed. By afternoon, the storm grew worse. Wind gusts shook the pine trees so violently that snow cascaded down the slopes in heavy avalanches. Then Titan's ears suddenly lifted. The dog looked toward the door. A faint sound had reached him through the storm. A distant cry. Titan barked once. Caleb looked up. "What is it?" Titan barked again. Then he struggled to stand. The injured leg trembled, but the dog forced himself upright. Caleb moved quickly to support him. "Hey, easy." Titan ignored the warning. He limped toward the door. Another faint sound echoed through the storm. A voice. Caleb froze. Someone was shouting outside. He grabbed his coat and pulled the door open. The wind nearly ripped it from his hands. Snow blasted into the cave. "Hello!" The voice came again. Through the swirling snow, Caleb saw shapes moving on the ridge. 3 figures struggled toward the mine entrance. One of them carried a small child wrapped in a blanket. Another stumbled and fell to his knees. Caleb ran forward through the snow. "What are you doing up here?" he shouted. The man carrying the child looked desperate. "The road's gone," he yelled back. "The truck slid off the ridge." Behind him, a woman clutched a younger boy who was crying uncontrollably. Their faces were pale from the cold. Caleb grabbed the man's arm and pulled him toward the cave. "Inside!" They stumbled through the doorway. The warmth hit them instantly. The woman nearly collapsed beside the stove. "Oh my God!" The child in the man's arms began to cry softly as feeling returned to his frozen hands. Titan limped forward despite the injury. The dog sniffed the children carefully, then wagged his tail weakly. The younger boy reached out and touched Titan's fur. "He's hurt," the boy whispered. Caleb nodded. "Got into a fight last night." The woman looked around the cave in amazement. "You live here?" "For now." The wind outside roared louder. Snow slammed against the door like waves against a ship. "How bad is the storm?" the man asked. Caleb looked toward the entrance. "It's just getting started." The man's expression tightened. "There are others in town trying to get to higher ground." Caleb's stomach sank slightly. "How many?" "Hard to say. The power went out this morning." Caleb turned toward the stove. More wood, more blankets, more space. This cave had been built to protect one man and his dog. Now it might have to protect many more. Titan moved closer to the children and lay down beside them. Despite the pain in his shoulder, the shepherd kept watch. The boy leaned gently against Titan's side. The dog didn't move away. Outside, the blizzard howled louder than ever. And Caleb Dawson suddenly realized something. The cave cabin he had built because people laughed at him might become the only safe place left on the mountain. The storm did not slow. By nightfall, the wind screamed across Bear Hollow Ridge like a freight train running through the sky. Snow piled against the entrance of the mine in thick walls that climbed higher every hour. Inside the cave, the small group huddled near the iron stove. The man who had carried the child introduced himself as Daniel Hargrove, a rancher whose land sat near the lower road outside Bear Hollow. His wife, Emily, wrapped blankets around their two boys while the warmth slowly returned to their frozen hands. Caleb Dawson placed another log into the stove. The fire crackled softly, pushing back the cold. "How long has the storm been like this?" Daniel asked. "Since early morning," Caleb replied. Daniel ran a tired hand across his face. "The power lines went down before noon. Half the town tried to leave before the roads closed." "And?" Daniel shook his head. "The road disappeared under drifts. I barely made it halfway up the ridge before the truck slid into a ditch." Caleb nodded slowly. He had expected something like that. Snowstorms in Montana had a way of turning small mistakes into life-or-death problems. Titan lay beside the children near the stove. Despite the bandaged shoulder, the German shepherd remained alert, watching the cave entrance every few minutes. The younger boy gently stroked Titan's fur. "He's brave," the boy whispered. Caleb looked over at them. "Yeah," he said quietly. "He is." Another hour passed. Then Titan suddenly lifted his head again. The shepherd listened. A distant sound reached him through the storm. Another voice. Caleb noticed instantly. "You hear that?" Daniel stood up slowly. The wind outside howled violently. But beneath it, faint and desperate, someone shouting. Caleb grabbed his coat again. "Stay here," he told them. He forced the door open. The storm hit like a wall. Visibility had dropped to almost nothing, but the voices were closer now. "Over here!" Caleb shouted into the wind. A figure stumbled out of the white haze, then another, and another. 3 men and an older woman fought through the snow toward the cave. Their coats were covered in ice. One of the men collapsed the moment he reached the entrance. Caleb grabbed him under the arm and dragged him inside. The others followed. Within minutes, the cave held 8 people. The air filled with exhausted breathing and the smell of wet wool. Emily quickly poured warm water into metal cups, while Caleb added more wood to the fire. Titan limped forward to sniff the newcomers. One of the men stared at the dog in surprise. "That's the army shepherd," he muttered. Caleb recognized the man. Tom Willis, one of the ranchers who had laughed the loudest in the diner when people talked about the crazy cave veteran. Tom avoided Caleb's eyes now. "Road's gone," he said quietly. Caleb nodded. "I figured." Another man spoke up. "There are still people down in the valley trying to get out." Caleb looked toward the storm outside. The wind had grown even stronger. "Anyone who tries climbing the ridge tonight won't make it," he said. Silence settled over the cave. The truth hung heavy in the air. Daniel looked around the chamber. "You built all this yourself?" Caleb shrugged slightly. "Had time." Daniel studied the stone ceiling, the wooden walls, the stove. "It's warmer in here than my house." Stone held heat. The mountain protected them from the wind. What had started as a survival shelter for one man had become something else entirely. A refuge. Another knock came against the door. Everyone turned. Titan barked sharply. Caleb moved quickly and pulled the door open again. Two more figures stumbled inside. A teenage girl and an elderly man, both shaking violently from the cold. The cave was crowded now. 10 people. 10 lives depending on the strength of the stone above them. The storm raged outside through the night, but inside the cave, warmth and light held steady. People who had once laughed about Caleb Dawson now sat quietly around his fire. Some avoided his eyes. Some looked at him with open gratitude. Titan remained near the center of the room. The children leaned against him while they slept. Even wounded, the shepherd kept watch. At one point in the middle of the night, Tom Willis spoke quietly from the other side of the stove. "I guess we owe you an apology." Caleb didn't answer immediately. He watched the flames move inside the iron stove. "We're alive," Tom continued, "because of this place." Caleb finally looked up. "You're alive because you made it here." Tom shook his head. "No." His eyes moved slowly around the cave. "You built this." The wind outside slammed against the mountain again, but the cave did not move. The stone walls stood firm, and for the first time since returning home from war, Caleb Dawson realized something. The place everyone had mocked had just saved the entire ridge. Morning arrived slowly after the storm. For 3 days the blizzard had swallowed Bear Hollow Valley. Wind had screamed across the mountains, snow had buried the roads, and the outside world had simply vanished. But eventually, even the fiercest storms run out of breath. When Caleb Dawson pushed open the heavy wooden door of the cave cabin on the 4th morning, sunlight poured across the ridge like liquid gold. The storm had passed. The world outside had changed. Snow covered everything. The pine trees bent under the weight of it. The ridge road had completely disappeared beneath towering drifts. The valley below looked like a frozen ocean. Behind Caleb, the cave slowly came alive. People stirred from their blankets near the fire. The children rubbed sleep from their eyes. Titan lifted his head from beside the stove. The shepherd's bandaged shoulder was healing slowly, though he still moved with a careful limp. Caleb crouched beside him. "How you holding up?" Titan's tail thumped softly. "Yeah," Caleb murmured. "We made it." One by one, the townspeople stepped outside. Daniel Hargrove stared across the valley in disbelief. "I've lived here 30 years, he said quietly. "Never seen snow like this." Tom Willis kicked at the drift near the entrance. "Road's gone," he muttered. "Probably for a week," Caleb replied. Emily wrapped her coat tighter around herself. If we hadn't found this place— Her voice faded. Nobody finished the sentence. They didn't have to. Inside the cave, warmth still radiated from the stone walls. The mountain had protected them. Later that afternoon, after everyone had eaten and rested, Caleb stood near the back passage of the cave. Titan limped beside him. The dog sniffed the air and then looked toward the tunnel that led deeper into the mine. Caleb hesitated. For days, the cave had been crowded with people. He had kept the second chamber hidden. But now something had changed. The townspeople had seen the truth. The cave had saved them. Maybe it was time to show them the rest.
Daniel, Caleb called.
The rancher walked over. What's back there? Daniel asked, nodding toward the passage. Something you should probably see. Soon several others gathered near the opening. Caleb lifted his lantern. Careful, he said. Watch your step. The narrow passage opened into the second chamber. Lantern light flickered across the stone walls. Tom Willis whistled softly. Didn't know this part existed. Most of it was buried, Caleb replied. Titan moved ahead of them. The dog walked straight toward the quartz wall. He sat down beside it, as if waiting. Caleb stepped forward and brushed dust away from the rock. The white quartz vein glowed faintly beneath the lantern. Daniel leaned closer. What is that? Caleb didn't answer immediately. Instead, he picked up the small hammer resting against the wall. One sharp strike. Stone cracked. A piece of quartz broke free. Golden flecks shimmered inside the rock. The chamber fell silent. Tom Willis leaned forward slowly. No way. Daniel took the fragment from Caleb's hand. His eyes widened. Is this? Caleb nodded once. Looks like gold. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The lantern light flickered across the stone walls. The vein stretched along the rock like a thin river frozen in time. Tom ran a hand through his hair. All this time. He looked back toward the cave entrance. The whole town thought this mountain was worthless. Caleb studied the vein carefully. This is just a trace, he said. But veins like this sometimes run deep. Daniel's voice lowered. You mean there could be more? Caleb shrugged. Could be. Titan wagged his tail slowly. The dog had discovered the first piece. Everyone in the chamber knew it. Tom looked at Caleb. You realize what this means, right? Caleb did. A gold vein meant everything changed. Land value, mining rights, companies, money, arguments, greed. He had seen enough conflict in his life to recognize how quickly something valuable could turn people against each other. Daniel handed the rock back to Caleb. What are you going to do? Caleb stared at the golden flecks inside the quartz. For a moment, the cave grew very quiet. Then footsteps echoed near the passage behind them. Sheriff Harold Pike appeared at the entrance to the chamber. He must have arrived while they were inside. The sheriff's eyes moved slowly across the group. Then they settled on the quartz vein, on the gold glimmering inside the rock. Pike let out a long breath. Well, he said quietly, I guess that explains why people were sneaking around your mountain. No one answered. The sheriff stepped closer. He studied the rock carefully. Then he looked at Caleb. I tried to buy this land from you, Pike said. Caleb nodded. 10,000. 15, actually. A faint smile crossed Caleb's face. Sheriff Pike shook his head slowly. Looks like I was about 100 years too late. The cave remained silent, but the meaning of what they had discovered echoed louder than the storm that had nearly buried them. Because the mountain that everyone had laughed at was now hiding something worth far more than anyone in Bear Hollow had ever imagined. The discovery changed the air inside the cave. For a long moment, no one spoke. The lantern light flickered against the quartz wall, making the golden flecks shimmer faintly inside the stone. What had once looked like an ordinary vein of rock now carried the weight of possibility. Sheriff Harold Pike stepped closer and crouched near the wall. He touched the quartz with his fingers. "Could be a real vein," he muttered. "Not just dust." Daniel Hargrove crossed his arms. "You think it runs deep?" Pike stood again and looked at Caleb. "Only one way to find out." Everyone turned toward Caleb Dawson. It was his land, his cave, his discovery. Titan sat quietly beside him, the German shepherd's tail brushing lightly against the cave floor. The bandage around his shoulder had begun to loosen as the wound slowly healed. Caleb rested a hand on the dog's neck. For a moment he said nothing. He had spent most of his life following orders. In the army, decisions were made by commanders. Out here on the mountain, the decision belonged to him alone. Tom Willis broke the silence first. "You could sell that land now and be rich," he said. Daniel nodded slowly. "Mining companies would pay a fortune." Sheriff Pike sighed. "He's not wrong." Caleb looked down at the quartz vein again. The gold glittered quietly in the rock. Not loud, not flashy. Just waiting. His mind drifted back through the past months. The laughter in the diner. The whispers in town. The looks people gave him when he walked through the grocery store. Crazy veteran, living in a cave. Then his thoughts moved further back. Long desert nights in places no one at home had ever heard of. Explosions in the distance. The weight of a rifle in his hands. And Titan lying beside him in the dust. War had taken many things from Caleb Dawson. Peace, sleep, friends. He had returned home with little more than a loyal dog and a mountain nobody wanted. Now the mountain was offering him something else. A second chance. Caleb stood slowly. Everyone waited. The cave felt very still. "I'm not selling," Caleb said. Tom blinked. "Not selling?" Caleb shook his head. "This mountain kept us alive." Daniel looked surprised. "You could make millions." "Maybe." Sheriff Pike studied Caleb carefully. "Then what are you planning to do?" Caleb looked toward the entrance of the cave. Outside the ridge still lay buried beneath snow. The blizzard had shown them something important. The valley was beautiful, but it was fragile. Every winter storms threatened the farms and homes scattered across Bear Hollow. People froze. Livestock died. Roads vanished. Caleb turned back to the group. "You saw what this cave did during the storm." Everyone nodded. "Stone keeps the heat in," Caleb continued, "and the mountain blocks the wind." Daniel's eyes slowly widened. "You're thinking about building more of these?" Caleb nodded. "Not caves. Houses." The word hung in the air. "Houses built into the mountain," Caleb explained. "Part underground, part outside. Warm in winter, safe during storms." Sheriff Pike raised an eyebrow. "You planning to turn Bear Hollow into a mining town?" Caleb shook his head. "No." "Then what?" Caleb's voice grew quieter. "A place where people don't freeze every winter." Tom let out a short laugh. "You'd spend gold on that?" Caleb met his gaze. "Yes." No one spoke for several seconds.
Finally, Daniel stepped forward. "You mean for the whole valley?" "If they want it." Sheriff Pike rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "That's a lot of work." Caleb shrugged.
"I've built worse things." Titan stood beside him and wagged his tail slowly. The dog seemed to approve. Emily Hargrove smiled softly. "I think people might stop calling you crazy after this." Tom chuckled. "They already stopped doing that the moment the storm hit." Sheriff Pike looked back at the quartz vein. "You know, this could change everything around here." Caleb nodded. "That's the idea." The sheriff extended his hand. "Well, Caleb Dawson, looks like Bear Hollow just found its builder." Caleb shook it. The grip was firm, respectful. For the first time since returning from war, Caleb felt something settle inside him. Not the restlessness that usually followed him everywhere. Something steadier. Purpose. Titan leaned gently against his leg. The German shepherd had been with him through war, through loneliness, through the long cold nights on the mountain. Now the dog wagged his tail again, as if he understood. The gold hidden inside the rock would bring change, but the real treasure had already revealed itself. Not wealth, a future. And Caleb Dawson had just decided what to do with it. Spring arrived slowly in Bear Hollow Valley. The snow that had buried the ridge all winter began to melt beneath longer days and warmer sunlight. Ice broke apart in the creeks that ran through the valley floor. Patches of brown grass appeared between the drifts. Life returned. Roads reopened. Trucks rolled through town again, and for the first time in many months, people from Bear Hollow climbed the ridge not to laugh, but to see. They came in small groups at first. Ranchers, families, curious neighbors. All of them followed the narrow path up Copper Ridge toward the cave cabin everyone had once mocked. Now the story was different. The blizzard had spread the truth faster than any rumor. The veteran who lived inside the mountain had saved them, and the dog beside him had nearly died protecting that mountain. By early summer, the ridge looked completely different. Caleb Dawson stood outside the cave entrance, studying the valley below. The air smelled of pine and fresh earth. Behind him, the sounds of construction echoed across the hillside. Hammers, voices, laughter. The work had already begun. Using the first profits from a small mining partnership, carefully managed and limited so the mountain wouldn't be destroyed, Caleb had hired local builders and engineers. Instead of tearing the mountain apart, they worked with it. Houses began to appear along the lower slopes, half built into the rock, half open to the sun. Thick stone walls held warmth during winter nights. Roofs covered with soil allowed grass and wildflowers to grow over them. From a distance, the homes almost disappeared into the mountainside. Natural, strong, safe. Daniel Hargrove supervised one group of builders. Tom Willis hauled lumber with his old truck. Even Sheriff Harold Pike spent his days helping coordinate permits and supply deliveries. The entire valley seemed to move with a shared purpose. And at the center of it all stood the cave cabin. Caleb still lived there. He had refused every offer to move into a larger house. "This place started it," he told Daniel once. "Feels wrong to leave it." Titan lay stretched across the sunny ground near the entrance. The German shepherd was older now. The scar on his shoulder remained visible beneath the fur, but the injury had healed. Children from the valley often ran up the ridge just to see him. They brought biscuits, sometimes old tennis balls. Titan accepted every gift with quiet patience. To the children, he was a hero. To the adults, he was something even more. Proof that loyalty still existed in a complicated world. One afternoon, Near the end of summer, Caleb walked up the hill above the cave. Titan followed him slowly. From the top of the ridge, the entire valley could be seen. New homes dotted the slopes. Smoke rose from chimneys. Fields stretched green across the valley floor. Bear Hollow looked stronger than it had in decades. Caleb rested his hands on the wooden railing of a small overlook the town had built. Beside it stood a stone marker. Sheriff Pike had insisted on it. Caleb had argued against the idea for weeks, but the town had refused to listen. The marker stood quietly beneath the open sky. Titan walked up beside it and sniffed the base. Caleb read the inscription once more. The letters were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had happened.
Caleb Dawson and Titan. The veteran and the dog who turned a cursed mountain into a home. Titan sat beside him. The dog looked across the valley as if guarding it. For a long moment, Caleb said nothing. Wind moved gently through the tall grass around the hill. In the distance, a child's laughter echoed across the fields. Peace. The word felt unfamiliar, but it also felt real. Caleb reached down and scratched Titan behind the ears. "Not bad for a crazy cave idea," he said quietly. Titan wagged his tail. Down in the valley, people still told the story. They told it in the diner, at the gas station, around campfires during summer evenings. They would smile and say the same thing every time. "We used to laugh at that veteran living in a cave." Then they would glance toward the ridge above Bear Hollow, toward the homes built into the mountain, toward the quiet stone cabin that had started it all. And they would finish the story the same way, until his dog found gold, and he chose to save all of us instead. Stories like Caleb and Titan remind us of something simple but powerful. Sometimes the people the world laughs at are the very ones who end up saving it. Now I'd love to hear from you. If you believe loyalty like Titan's still exists in this world, type 1 in the comments. If you think Caleb made the right choice by helping the town instead of chasing the gold for himself, type 0. And tell me something else, too. Where are you watching this story from today? I read the comments every day, and I love seeing how far these stories travel across the world.
If this story touched your heart, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell, because the next story we're about to share might be even more unbelievable. Another veteran, another loyal dog, and another moment that could change everything. And who knows? The next legend we tell here might start with someone just like you watching right now.